Here we continue with the second edition in the 3-book series on Byzantium. Today I will discuss how this civilization shaped the modern world and how Christians perceive secularism itself. I go over some of the highlights that I consider important, and I will try to persuade you into getting this wonderful trilogy. So stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video. I always have to mention this as a reminder because it really helps the channel to grow if you share it with people when you like it. It doesn't take you much of an effort and it really helps what I'm doing here. And if you like what I'm doing, this will really increase its visibility. I'll also put my X account on the bottom if you want to communicate with me directly, and my Ko-Fi if you want to donate, tip, whatever you want to do, and also check out my merch store as a promotional effort for the channel. In this episode, I'm going over Byzantium, the Apogee by John Julius Norwich, and this edition is from Folio Society, which I love. They always do great quality books and awesome collections. Now, in the previous review of Volume 1, I said it was from 1990 because that particular edition, at least the original, was published at the time. But this one mentions the original copyright date, but also the version that is being used here, which is the 1993 version. So it seems that the book may not actually give me the true publication date of this Folio Society work. So I have to kind of generalize and say it's in the 90s. And that's the best I can do at this point. But you can get whatever edition you want. Content is king, as I always say. So paperback, hardcover, or the folio edition, you can find many of these online. And they're all good for the content. I just love these editions. You can get whichever one you want. I'll try to be as brief as possible. And a book of this nature is difficult because it has a lot of important things to point out. One aspect that stands out for me in this volume is how the very apogee of this empire is disturbingly underwhelming. And what I mean by this is that most empires have a peak, a moment in time, which is the apogee, in which they are at their maximum power, at their maximum influence, at their heights of culture and beauty and art, etc. And I don't see that with Byzantium per se. I have a sense that they did reach high levels of influence, political success, and obviously religious impact. But I think it's primarily tainted by pure chaos, bureaucracy, and incompetence. I think as an empire, it's not as impressive as others I have studied. Now, of course, this is a personal feel and opinion, but I thought it would be relevant to share it with you. A good example of the horror and strangeness of it all is the story of Saint Irene, the first true empress of Byzantium. She was a hardcore iconodule, which means she was in favor of icons, if you're not familiar with the term. And when her husband Leo IV died, she became regent of her son, but she immediately began to plot, to maneuver, to scheme, to the point of eventually arresting her son and blinding him in a very gruesome and disturbing way. And it led the way to her installing herself as the first empress on her own right, not as Augusta, as usually happened in Byzantium. And she was highly unpopular, but she also promulgated the Second Council of Nicaea, which re-established the veneration of images, icons. So she is received and considered a saint in the Eastern Church, but of course, her unpopularity was based on the fact that she did something horrible. And this is a good example of my point. It's a disturbingly strange scenario to have such a personality to be considered a saint or a leader that merits any kind of reverence when she was clearly an ambitious psychotic of sorts. And even if she had some good points, as every human being does, at the same time, the mutilation and plotting against a son is quite evil. At least, I think so, from an objective point of view. So that's the kind of conundrum I'm describing. It's common in every empire, of course, but it seems to me to be a great example of the problem that I have with Byzantium at its height. And of course, her unpopularity led to the return of Iconoclasm and an eventual ban of female empresses. And again, this is another exemplification that it's not just me viewing her actions as reprehensible, but a general sentiment. And here's a quote that I think underlines what I'm saying. The emperors Constantine and Leo considered the safety of the empire to depend on orthodoxy, formally gathered a numerous synod of spiritual fathers and bishops, and condemned the unprofitable practice, unwarranted by tradition, of making and adoring icons, preferring worship in spirit and in truth. On this account, the Church of God remained tranquil for a number of years, and the people enjoyed peace until the government passed from man to a woman, and the Church became the victim of feminine simplicity. This woman followed the counsel of ignorant bishops. She convoked an injudicious assembly. She laid down the doctrine of painting in a material medium the Son and Word of God, and of representing the Mother of God and the saints by dead images. And she enacted that these representations should be adored, thus heedlessly defying the proper doctrine of the Church. In such a way did she sully our adoration which is due to God alone, declaring that what should be given only to Him should be offered to lifeless icons. Now this is a quote of the time by a council doing an analysis basically of what happened at the time of Saint Irene. But keep in mind that even though I'm using that quote to represent the viewpoint at the time of her actions, it is quite clear also that it was the influence of Islam on Christianity that began to turn iconodules to iconoclasts. I think there's plenty of historical evidence that from the very beginning, Christians had no issues with images. You can see that in ancient churches, even ancient synagogues in Anatolia. So that at the end of the day, the iconoclast lost that fight from a historic and cultural perspective. Nonetheless, it gives you a picture into the situation. And of course, by restoring the veneration of icons, the church became what we know of it today when it comes to its practices on this account. There was another female saint that, again, reestablished the practice, and to this day is celebrated as the Triumph of Orthodoxy. And then this began a reverse persecution once more against the iconoclasts, just like the iconoclasts were persecuting the iconodules. And this again is consistent with the factionalism that was so prevalent in Byzantium. And this is one of the issues that I, again, find to be quite fascinating and disturbing. That one of the main characteristics of Byzantium is its hardcore persecution of every single faction imaginable within Christianity. From the Polians, which were in Armenia, and honestly, I don't see much of a point in persecuting them. It created really quite a negative effect historically because they ended up siding with Muslims against Byzantium because of their persecution. If they wouldn't have done that, it could have saved Byzantium a lot of years of hardship. But even this fight between the iconodules and iconoclasts was quite harsh. Blindings, amputations, exiles, executions, and every little aspect of Christian theology was debated in this fashion. Every time a new emperor would come in, they would recall the old patriarch and then exile and cut the tongue of the other one. And it will go on and on and on. Another aspect of this point of the Apogee is the constant political wrangling between Rome and Constantinople, fighting over influence in different bishoprics, fighting over territory like Bulgaria. Who's going to have jurisdiction? Is it Rome or is it Constantinople? Theological issues like celibacy of the priesthood, the Filioque, all of them became part of a geopolitical struggle. So that in many ways, those Christians that believe that many of their theological and historical positions are based merely on theology or philosophy are ignoring a key element, which is politics. And this is why I've always said you cannot separate politics from religion. This is impossible. And even those that attempt are being hypocritical, because these two things always go together, as they always will. And if a state says that they're not religious, they just impose a new religion, like in the West, where you have hyper-egalitarianism and humanism as their religion, to the exclusion of others. But there's always going to be some cult that runs politics. Now, here's an example of politics and theology kind of coming together on one particular topic. Let it now be absolutely clear to all that if any shall dare to proceed to a fourth marriage, which is no marriage, not merely shall such a pretended marriage be of no validity and the offspring of it be illegitimate, but it shall be subject to the punishment prescribed for those who are soiled with the filth of fornication. It being understood that the persons who have indulged in it shall be separated from each other. Now that was a controversy because of the emperor assuming a fourth marriage. And the emperor could have just simply invalidated his earlier marriage and just considered it a third. But because it was a public political issue, he couldn't do that. He had to play along and accept whatever the patriarch would say on this matter, which involved penance for a year, which involved the political struggle, the amount of marriages that were allowed, etc., which is today still a controversy between East and West, because the West considers the possibility of divorce itself to be contrary to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Of course, Jesus did put a caveat on the no divorce dynamic, which is quite interesting, and the West interprets it not as divorce per se, but as a separation, whereas in the East, it was considered to be a proper divorce, and then you were allowed to do it up to the third point, always with penances, always as a negative, but interpreting that verse in the New Testament as allowing, in the case of fornication or adultery, a true actual divorce. But the point is, this idea of stopping at 4 in particular, or 3 or 2, had political dynamics that people seem to ignore. Byzantium had many weird, strange, and perverse practices that had become normalized. And here today, we talk about these strange phenomena in which the state is allowing private citizens to do very weird stuff. But let me give you an example of what I'm talking about in Byzantium. By the 10th century, to be a eunuch was, for a promising youth about to enter the imperial service, a virtual guarantee of advancement. Many an ambitious parent would have a younger son castrated as a matter of course. The practice may seem strange, even barbarous, but the reasons are in fact not far to seek. Eunuchs, with no wives or family to support, tended to be far more industrious and dedicated than their more completely endowed colleagues. Since they left no sons, there was no tendency for certain offices to become hereditary, as happened so often in the West. Posts could be awarded on merit alone. By the same token, they constituted an invaluable bulwark against the feudalism which was to cause the empire more and more trouble, particularly in Asia Minor, as the century progressed. So we know that for social advancement today, many parents are doing something similar, which to some is considered to be good, but I think we can objectively say castrating children is perverse and evil. But here we see that in Byzantium, the practice was there for political advancement, for ambitions as well. And that gives you an example of how certain freakish behavior in human beings comes back to haunt us every once in a while. Now, of course, the empire did have its flair, its artistic power, which can't be denied. So I'm not only highlighting what I consider to be negative or strange. And I'm going to quote an example of it because I think it's impressive, and I can't imagine seeing this and being impacted psychologically and even spiritually by it. And this is basically stemming from 2 envoys from Venice that were received by the emperor in an audience, and this is what they saw. Next to the imperial residence at Constantinople, there is a palace of remarkable size and beauty, which the Greeks call Magnaura, the name signifying fresh breeze. Before the throne of the emperor, there rose a tree of gilded bronze, its branches full of birds fashioned of the same material, all singing different songs according to their kind. The throne itself was so contrived that at one moment it stood low on the ground, and the next moment it would suddenly be raised high in the air. It was of immense size, made of either wood or bronze, for I cannot be sure, and guarded by gilded lions who beat the ground with their tails and emitted dreadful roars, their mouths open and their tongues quivering. Leaning on the shoulders of two eunuchs, I was led into the emperor's presence. Immediately the lions began to roar and the birds to sing, but I myself displayed no terror or surprise at these marvels, having received prior warning from others who were already well acquainted with them. After I had 3 times made my obeisance, I raised my head, and lo, he whom I had seen only a moment before on a throne scarcely elevated from the ground was now clad in different robes and sitting on a level with the roof. How this was achieved I cannot tell, unless it was by a device similar to those we employ for lifting the timbers of a wine press. Now, I actually have read a very similar description from a different witness, and of course this would have made quite an impression. It's a production. It's a magical production, and it's spectacular. The flair, the power. When you compare these things with modern heads of state, it's pathetic and quite laughable. So I can appreciate the drama involved in this. Another watershed moment in its history, as we know, is the entry of Russia into the Byzantine fold, into the Christian Orthodox Church. And it changed the history of the world. So the whole story is worth taking a look at because of its impact. There's also a revolution in 1042 that quite impressed me, seeing vicious hordes of the masses attacking the imperial palace, asking for the female heirs to the throne to be returned from exile. 3,000 of them dying, fighting against the emperor's troops to eventually achieve the goal. The emperor afraid, calling the empresses and bringing them in and putting them in the balcony and asking for mercy and still not being able to quench their anger. It's quite an impressive event, and it gives you a perspective how empires and traditional monarchies were still beholden to the people at the end of the day, even if it took radical violence. And I think a lot of times people think that an emperor or a dictator like Caesar or a monarch is somehow unaccountable because modern people are so weak that they assume that human beings will not revolt. There's a tendency of thinking that human beings will just accept whatever catastrophe, whatever abuse from the state, because they do so now. The American Revolution happened for very low taxes, and people are being taxed 5-6 times what they were, and they accept it. So because of that, they assume that if you have a monarch, it'll be over for them. They would have no ability to impose their will on their government. But in the past, this was not the case. Emperors, kings were constantly being overturned, removed by the people, even if it took a large toll. So I'm just pointing that out, that I think it's a fascinating point of view. Now, the Great Schism, of course, is a great topic here because it happened during this moment in Byzantine history, and it marks the beginning of the end for Byzantium itself. Now, of course, what's interesting about this collapse of the union between the East and West, a lot of it has to do with the papal legates that were sent to Byzantium. And again, politics have a lot to do with it because their actions were not necessarily approved by the Pope, but they were nonetheless important because these were the representatives of Rome. And a lot of political situations made worse by both sides created the eventual result. So let me give you a quote that I think explains some of the issues here. Few important documents have been so full of demonstrable errors. It is indeed extraordinary that a man of Humbert's learning could have penned so lamentable a manifesto. It began by refusing to Cerularius, both personally and as a bishop of Constantinople, the title of patriarch. It declared that there was nothing to be said against the citizens of the empire or of Constantinople, but that all those who supported Cerularius were guilty of simony, of encouraging castration, a practice that was also followed at Rome, of insisting on rebaptizing Latins, which at the time was untrue, of allowing priests to marry, which was incorrect. A married man could become a priest, but no one who was already ordained could marry, of baptizing women in labor, even if they were dying, a good early Christian practice, of jettisoning the Mosaic law, which was untrue, of refusing communion to men who had shaved their beards, which again was untrue, though the Greeks disapproved of shaven priests, and finally of omitting a clause in the creed, which was the exact reverse of the truth. After such accusations, complaints about the closing of the Latin churches at Constantinople and of disobedience to the papacy lost their effect. So you can see there how this kind of weird, manipulative letter with half-truths or twisted realities was used to put pressure on Byzantium, thinking that would work. And of course, it didn't, and eventually led to the schism. A small point that I want to mention is that the book mentions the donation of Constantine, which is a forgery that is used by the West to kind of justify papal supremacy. But I found interesting that this book gives you evidence that the Eastern Church also used the same letter to justify many of their own claims and their interest in general. So that's also fascinating because both sides would use this forgery to their advantage. Now, when it comes to the structure of Byzantium, this is always debatable because you would have right-wing people and left-wing people, and I'm using those terms in today's definitions, will use empires like Byzantium to present their particular model as the best model or the model that is being represented. So I want to give a quote that basically describes the structure, economic and political of Byzantium, because I think it paints a good picture that I think we can learn from today. Once again, the bureaucracy was all-powerful, operating on a scale unmatched anywhere else, with the possible exception of China, for several centuries. For it has to be remembered that the Byzantine Empire, absolute monarchy though it might be, ran its economy on distinctly socialist lines. Capitalism was allowed, but rigidly controlled at every stage. Production, labor, consumption, foreign trade, public welfare, and even the movement of populations were all firmly in the hands of the state. The consequence was a vast army of civil servants taking its orders theoretically from the emperor, though effectively more often than not from Silos and his friends, and inspired, so far as one can see, by one overriding principle: to curb, if not to actually destroy, the power of the army. So you see, that combination of elements, the state controlling a lot of aspects of the economy, with some free trade and a focus on political bureaucracy, is similar to a combination of elements that today would be called either right or left. Now, of course, there's an anachronistic element in this description because the terms socialism and capitalism don't belong in Byzantium, obviously. But I understand his point, and I think he's using these terms anachronistically so that the reader can understand what he means without having to clarify that these terms don't exist and didn't exist and that we should use them differently. I mean, that would add another paragraph. But the point is, in the ancient world, people didn't see things in that kind of category. The empire would function the way it did, and it didn't really require too much of a categorization. Now, obviously, the true demographic catastrophe is the arrival of the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia and the slow removal, kind of ethnic cleansing of the Greek Christian population of the area. And as that began to happen, little by little, you can see the beginning of the end of the Byzantine Empire. And I know for sure the third volume is going to go into the result of this. But as some people say, demographics are indeed destiny. If you have a population in a region and that population is removed, a new population will come in, and therefore a new history begins. And this has happened all over the history of mankind, but it is crucial to point out that it is a fact, because some people try to argue that demographic shifts don't mean anything, and that is obviously untrue, and history proves it. Now, in which position are you in? the one being demographically cleansed or the one doing the cleansing, and which one do you favor? That's a different story. But it doesn't change reality. It's just something to think about because it is impactful in the story of the Byzantine Empire and its collapse. So, awesome book, awesome volume. It's an impressive history. It's an impressive attempt at understanding its development. And I do suggest you get a copy and go through it. I think you will benefit. And of course, I always tell people, it's one perspective. Always get different books of the same topic if you want to dig deeper, because if you don't, you'll have a somewhat limited perspective. If you have a point of view on this, if you have another book you will suggest on the topic that you think will give me a different perspective, put it in the comments. But please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video. I really appreciate you folks being with me, and I hope you enjoy the review. See you next time.